to Giulia, who is going to be talking to us about overcoming negativity bias. So, Giulia, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dragometrics, for having me on the webinar. This is a talk that I gave already, but I loved it. I love delivering it, and I love researching into it because I learned some things about organizational behavior, but also about my personal, challenges, I guess. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Giulia. I come from Italy, where I graduated first in psychobiology and then in cognitive neuroscience and clinical neuropsychology. And then I proceeded to join a few research labs, focusing especially on attentive, social, and motor processes. And then I cannot move, 1 second. And then I came to London for a 6 months work experience that ended up being my permanent move to the UK. So I transitioned into the industry as an SEO and currently serve as an in-house director of customer acquisition for a global brand. However, my passion remains neuroscience. So I have a small consultancy called Neuroscientive, where I research consumer behavior and talk about it. And my most recent title change has been that of being upgraded to wife. So my husband and I had this beautiful ceremony, a reception in my home country. Everything went amazing. The weather was great. Everyone came and we had a lot of fun, as you can see in this picture. However, where the hell was the cake topper? This was my only thought after, the event. The venue forgot to put it. It was a 12 pounds plastic thing that nobody knew needed to be there. And that winded me up so much during the following days that it kind of ruined a bit, or it tainted the memory. And that was the only thing that I could recall for the days after when people talked to me about the wedding. So if you find yourself in this sort of situation as well in our everyday life, when you focus more on the negative more than the positive side of things, it's not because you're a particularly negative or pessimistic person, but because as humans, we develop very early on the natural tendency to allocate more value to negative stimuli as compared to positive ones that carry the same emotional load. And this phenomenon is called negativity bias. The negativity bias influences a number of areas in our daily life. So from the way that we process information and also retrieve it, as we mentioned, like the way that I talked about my wedding back in the day, to the way that we make decisions both online and also offline. I initially talked about the negativity bias within the context of cognitive biases in another talk. And then a few days after delivering it, I came across something that caught my eye on LinkedIn. And it was this quote by a contact of mine saying, "Did you know that the human brain is simply not capable of seeing the negative? It cannot physically comprehend it." And I'm not sure whether this contact of mine got this information, but because there wasn't any source or other context to the claim. However, the neuroscientist in me went down the rabbit hole because I got curious. I'm like, is it actually true? And that claim is actually untrue. Our brain is more than capable of seeing the negative. Several studies, for example, have highlighted functional asymmetries skewed towards negative events and negative stimuli. This has been shown on neuroimaging studies and also ERP studies. And one of these studies, specifically, it was a neuroimaging study, linked the negativity bias to a bilateral hyperactivity, so extensive activity of this area called pregenual anterior cingulate cortex, which is an area involved in emotional regulation and also in interoception. The same area also has a stronger activation when stimuli are internally attended, so when it's something that we perceive from the inside, something that comes from us, versus stimuli that are externally attended. Which might be also the reason why we're way more susceptible to our negative self-talk rather than somebody else telling us we're great. There's been, I really have a challenge with this clicker today. It's on my end though. So there's also ERP studies that study the brain activation patterns once we get exposed to a stimulus. And they highlighted larger amplitudes of the late positive potential, which is an activation pattern related to perceived emotional intensity of a stimulus when it comes to perceiving negative events as compared to neutral and positive events. So we just have this hyperactivation on the negative side of things rather than the positive side. And when we go down to the behavioral level, to what we actually display in the real world, we do show an hyper attention to the negative, which rules out that from the very early age, we display this behavior. So it rules out that it's actually a learned behavior. The brain just seems more capable to see and respond to the negative. So how did he actually start? Where does this over attention come from? There are a number of theories that have started to try to explain why we have this over attention to the negative. And one of them is that the negativity bias is, so ingrained in our life because it's linked to an evolutionary role. So we developed this over attention to threat because it was the only way that our species could survive. And right now, we're not running away from loose beasts anymore for the majority of our life. Other than maybe the trolls that we found online sometimes. But yet the negativity bias still affects most part of our life, starting from our online behavior, from the first touch points until the post-transaction. And you can see in this study, I always bring it up because I found it so indicative of the point. This study of SEO clarity, I tend to cite a lot. It was a test by to show the impact of negative headlines on CTRs. So basically, SEO Clarity took this array of results on the SERP and showed that titles that contained a negative superlative, like never or worst, actually had more click-through rates than their positive or neutral counterpart. And I'm the first one to fall for this, not only on the SERP, even when we leave it and go to our inbox, which one did I, in this array of emails from the same provider, which one did I go for? I click on the one that said, the most dangerous hike, because it made me curious. And when I went back to Italy, for example, and I was served, a very tragic title on the discovery page, yeah, I felt for the same thing. Bear in mind that I'm not particularly attached to this actor, but the language used in the headline made me curious because, something must have happened. They cited a tragedy, a painful goodbye. And so I clicked through because I was curious to see what actually happened. And, only to find out that the dude isn't actually dead, luckily for him. He just abandoned TV temporarily to focus on theater. So you can tell how much the media exploits this negativity bias, and we're consistently biased. We're consistently exposed to these clickbaiting techniques. The platform we use on a daily basis are part of the problem because they know that there's higher engagement to be had if they push on our emotions, and especially the negative ones. But even when we leave, the first part of the funnel, when we're just getting acquainted to something, even when we go through the funnel and we land on websites that maybe don't intentionally game on the bias, they might actually be victim themselves of the negativity bias when they don't provide a flawless experience. So imagine, for example, that you land on a website that offers exactly what you're looking for, but you get onto a blocker, and that could be a page loading slowly, it could be the flow being unclear, it could be crucial information that is missing from the page, or the dreaded 4 pages. And even though you've encountered a positive experience until then, you're more likely to remember the negative part of this experience and maybe even to abandon the journey. Even at the checkout level, when you've already gone so far within the funnel that you've spent so much energy researching, you found what you're looking for, but these kind of reasons make up to 78% of the reasons why a user abandons at the checkout stage. This is a study by Baymard. They ran it first, I think, in 2022 on a larger scale, but then these reasons keep on coming back every time they rerun the same study. And even in the post-purchase stage, a study from last year by Zendesk showed how we're more likely to leave a negative review, even when unprompted, as compared to the positive one. Even when you think you go to a restaurant, for example, when you have a great experience, are you really likely, when I'm prompt, to leave a review, or do you postpone, like a positive review, or do you postpone it? I tend to postpone it, but if it's a negative one, then I tend to leave a review anyway. So, you know, it affects a lot of the stages, even when it comes to retention. So we're never safe. You know, one small mistake gets remembered much more than a positive action. So all of these examples suggest that we're hardwired for negativity, which can be, you know, super helpful when there's an actual threat, even online. However, sometimes, you know, negativity bias doesn't really serve as a purpose. So when there's a non-threatening situation, it can actually become maladaptive and hinder our path to growth. So there was this other study that I came across recently from the Harvard Business Review that showed that consuming just 3 minutes of negative news during the day in the morning can impact the way we report on our days. So there's 27% more chances that the day gets reported as very bad as compared to somebody that, for example, has consumed positive or neutral news. And that also affects the way that we are efficient at work. This is because, you know, because of negative priming, which is another sort of phenomenon. We could go down another rabbit hole, but for the time being, I'll just leave it there. But a systematic over-attention to the negative can transform into pessimism. And this has an implication on the way we feel about ourselves, our performance, and sometimes even our health. I'm not going to speculate on the last point today, but there seems to be evidence that suggests that too. There's a great story to illustrate this point about self-perception that was shared by Kirsty Hulse. She is a great trainer and speaker who was delivering a training once. And at the back of the room, she saw this one person sitting with their arms crossed, you know, having this very serious expression on. And that was super distracting to her, to the point that during the break, she went up to them and asked, is there anything that I could do better? Because I'm kind of sensing you're not enjoying the training. And they just said, no, it's just that I cannot actually see from there. Like I'm, you know, I cannot see well and I'm sitting too far behind. So what she did was like, she just moved them way up. And that tells you that when we don't have enough information to process, we just tend to assume the worst. We just tend to assume a negative outcome, and that's a negative outcome that is related to our own performance, when sometimes it's just not accurate. So last year, I got curious and I ran a questionnaire to see how this translates to our professional life. And I gathered answers from 124 professionals at different stages of their career. The questionnaire investigated both negative and positive feelings in the workplace related to different areas. And the presentation of questions was also randomized in order to avoid the negative priming, so kind of like leading them to answer negatively. And most of these questions were actually presented in form of statements to which participants had to indicate to what level they agree with it. So for example, one of the statements could have been, I feel confident in my skills. And then they had to indicate strongly agree, strongly disagree, or like anything in between. So I came to this with a few hypotheses. And to be honest, when I saw the results rolling in, I was a bit taken aback because I was going to do, you know, this talk in a very different way. But it taught me so much because, you know, all of the hypotheses that I had were pretty much falsified. So the first myth that was falsified was that we hear a lot, no news is good news. So, you know, when you don't actually hear feedback on your work, it must mean it's okay. However, it's not really it, because 64% of participants link the lack of feedback to a negative performance or a negative outcome. The same goes for lack of context. So when someone puts a meeting on our calendar, for example, I think this is the classic example that always comes up, and they don't put context, especially if it's coming from somebody more senior than us, we tend to assume that we tend to assume it's because we did something wrong. And that it was true for the majority of participants. And then career ambiguity is also something that affects people and creates negative feelings. When there is no clear goal in our development plan, we tend to assume that we're either going to get stuck into it or even regress. So this brings me to the second myth and the second hypothesis that I came to the questionnaire with, which was that negativity bias is actually something that in the workplace only affects that part of people that maybe doesn't feel super confident in their skills. However, more than half participants ruminate on perceived failures at work and let these thoughts dominate basically their time outside work as well. And it might not seem as a great start because it's pretty much half and half, but if you think, a lot of these people, like the vast majority, are actually people that know that they can do their job well. And yet, not only that, but they also report healthy ways to face challenges because they know that they're contributing positively to the organization, as stated in the questionnaire. They report a can-do attitude. They see setbacks as temporary hurdles and not a permanent feature of their, life. And they take on feedback as opportunities to grow. So these are all people that actually have the tools to contradict this bias and yet fall for it. And the third hypothesis is that the level of seniority was a predictor of a more positive attitude in the workplace. And I thought so because I thought that someone more senior probably, as compared to someone who is more junior into the organization, has had some more exposure to both failures and also successes. So they're more equipped to deal with negativity. However, there's also like a neuroscientific component, which is that as we age, there's been shown how there's more of a bilateral activation. So this functional asymmetry for negativity is actually does not affect older people as much as younger participants. But in this context, because maybe like the seniority was intended more from an organizational perspective and a role perspective, and it might not be representative of the age, the C-level participants were the ones that on average displayed more negative scores, which to me was super surprising to see. But maybe that's because they face more pressure as well. So this remains to be determined, but this was a really surprising result for me. And finally, I thought that, there was going to be a gender imbalance that affects the way we experience negativity. And for once, I was right. These graphs report the negative scores. And you know what? My males here were doing great. They were positive on average, even on negative score, on a negative scale. So yeah, keep up the good work, males. So the next point is, why should organization care about the negativity bias? We've seen, like that in an organizational space, a lot of people can be impacted. And not only the people are impacted, but also areas and functions. So it affects the way, negativity bias affects the way that we pick up and select certain information to act upon it. But it also correlates with the resistance to change. And we know, especially in our industry, how we actually want to be flexible. It's part of our job and, adapting to change. If you're an SEO, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It also impairs decision-making when we have a negative outlook, precisely because we might only select parts of the overall information that we have available to make a decision, and also because it creates decision paralysis, and sometimes we actually do need to make a decision. Research has also shown that individuals that individuals in the same organization experience something that's called emotional resonance. So basically, we just react as, the same way that somebody else is going to react. If there is one disgruntled employee, they might talk to other employees and they might affect the way that the other employees feel about the organization. So it's like, kind of spreading like wildfire. So we can already tell by these statements that a pessimistic organization is not really set up for success. And there was this research by Martin Seligman in a book called Learned Optimism. It's a great book. It's a bit old, but I like these basically is, has inspired the next part and has made me learn a lot about ways to overcome the negativity bias. And his entire career was basically trying to predict the outcome of different things based on explanatory styles. In particular, he took an interest in two teams, two baseball teams, that were playing the National League in 1986, and tried to work out the explanatory styles of each one of the players based on interviews they were giving. So just to go back on the explanatory styles and what they mean. The explanatory styles for Seligman can be either pessimistic or optimistic and are made up of three main dimensions, being permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. And these roughly translates to permanence being, for example, when we attribute something to either a temporary situation rather than a permanent factor. Like when, for example, if we have an explanatory style that's optimistic, we would more likely, we would be more likely to associate a bad report that a badly received report as something that, I didn't do well on this particular report. But if I have a pessimistic explanatory style, I might just be like, oh, I'm always bad at reports. The pervasiveness dimension is how much adversity transposes to other areas of our life. So if you perceive, negativity or like negative experiences as a temporary hurdle or something that is catastrophic and affects other areas of our life. So for example, you deliver this report, it's not received very well by the client, and then you're like, oh, I'm gonna get fired. Or, you have this sort of cascade events that you create in your mind. And finally, personalization, which is when you either blame it to yourself completely or you blame it to or take into consideration that there might be external factors. So based on these explanatory styles that Seligman tried to gather or like tried to infer based on the interviews that these players were given, he worked out that one of the teams had a more optimistic explanatory style versus the other team that had a more pessimistic one. And his prediction was that a positive explanatory style was more predictive of success than skill or talent, not only across this game, but across a number of domains. And he was able to confirm that, not only for other domains, but obviously in this case as well. So in this particular scenario, the two teams, he predicted that it wouldn't be the favorite team or the most skilled to win, but the ones that had the optimistic explanatory style. And he was right. So given that this massively affects our organizational behavior, there's different things that companies can focus on proactively to overcome the tendency to focus on the negative. So one thing that we saw from the questionnaire, we saw that context ambiguity and any kind of ambiguity is not perceived well. So the first thing is to minimize ambiguity. So we can, we need to provide context when we can. We need to be transparent with our communication whenever we can. The second point is balancing the interview focus. So I think there's a lot of, I haven't been really like involved in the process for a while, but I think when I was job searching a long time ago, there was this sort of focusing on the, all of the boxes that I couldn't tick as compared to the description, rather than all of the other things that maybe were not 100% match, but could have expanded in the organization. So if you come to an interview as a recruiter with this negative priming or this negative outlook and this absolute need to have people to match 100% the boxes that you give them, it's actually not helping your organization, because you're preventing the organization from having new perspectives and new skills. The other thing is to modify the language. If we do just small tweaks, it creates reframing. Like it can reframe an experience, a negative experience, to something that's fostering a bit more growth. And it forces the interlocutor to see more avenues to solve something than actually seeing something as a failure only. So some of these examples are not referred to something as an issue, but as an opportunity. Something that might be a problem, don't actually focus on the problem, focus on the solutions that you propose, and try to juggle ideas on solutions. Failures shouldn't be referred to as failures. I found, especially this not only on the professional side, but even on the personal, on a personal level, I found failures to be associated more with redirection, a more positive way to overcome these temporary feelings of negativity, because it's, you know, making you see other ways that this path could lead you to growth rather than just failure. And finally, celebrate wins regularly. Actually, it's not finally, I got one more after this, but celebrate wins regularly. There's the shout out to the Women in Tech SEO, this community that I'm part of, and a lot of other women are part of. They have Winning Wednesday. It's when people celebrate just a small win. Could be a small win, could be a big win, but they just celebrate it because we need the space to do so. And that's especially true for freelancer, which is something that I haven't shown today. But freelancer had significantly more negative scores than people who were working in-house. So that's extremely important to provide a space to celebrate. And enabling two-way feedback is another solution that organizations can focus on. You know, enabling this reciprocal way of communication, because in that way you open up ways that your employees can talk to you and give feedback rather than only having feedback that's coming from the top. This is because when we don't feel like we have some control, we tend to fall into this pattern of learned helplessness, which is when we basically know we have no chance to control anything, so we don't even try to do so. And obviously that from an organizational perspective or a personal perspective, that's not great. And finally, provide mentorship opportunities. This is especially helpful to sort of remove the blinders that an employee might have when they focus only on the ways they might not fit 100% the mold that they're given, and they miss out on seeing their strengths actually, or even, you know, they might be not seeing what their other path might be, because sometimes we're in a job, but it's not the job that makes us happy. It's not the job that actually brings out our strengths. And we might need somebody to make the right questions and like make us reflect that this is not the only way. Like we got so many other opportunities. So we've seen what work can do to flip the script, and that's all good because obviously like we spend at work a lot of our life. But the thing is that we carry into our own homes a lot of these negative thoughts that originate in the workplace. So we need to do some groundwork on a personal level as well. So in the daily life, we have a great tool, which is called neuroplasticity. I talked about this on the SEO mindset as well before, and it's sort of a superpower in our hands. Because we might be born with negativity in our veins and in our brains, but we also got the ability of changing that. And that's by means of, you know, the capacity of our brain to reorganize functionally and structurally as a function of learning. So if we actively learn on, and we actively work on challenging these automatic negative thoughts that might come up as a result of a negative experience, we can actually get to a point where the highway to the negative in our mind is replaced by a path of growth. So we can learn some techniques to change our thoughts, our behaviors as well, and our responses to adversity. And one model that I found super helpful, it's still like used from positive psychologists. It's called the ABC model. Now you see ABCDE because there's a second part to this original model that was developed by Albert Ellis, and we're going to touch on it afterwards. But the first part of this model is basically working on detaching your beliefs from your truth. So what it actually stands for is A, being your unpleasant or adverse situation, B, what you think, and C, what you feel and do as a result. So if we take an example, the report example, the adverse or unpleasant situation that we get to analyze, and we can take a piece of paper whenever this happens. You can actually just take a piece of paper and write down, because I feel like it might help isolate situations and feelings more than just talking through it. But the adverse or pleasant situation in this case would be, okay, my report was not received well, or I delivered a bad report. What you think, the B, belief, it was my fault. I'm bad at reports. And what do you feel or do as a result? You feel really down. You feel like you're not good at your job, and you dread the next time you have to deliver a report. That's just an example, but can work with a number of other situations in our life. So the second part of the model that was developed later on is based on the ways that we cope with these beliefs that are now detached from our experience. So we know now that what happens and our beliefs are not equal, but we know also that we have tools to sort of overcome that tendency to take them all together. So the ways that we can cope with negative thoughts are by distraction and disputation, for example, where one of these is a bit more temporary. Distraction is a good, emergency measure, I guess. So if this happened today, say that I delivered this report today, it was not received well. If I have any other deadlines today, I'm just going to focus on other deadlines, and I'm going to, I'm going to address it in the capacity that I need to for my job. But then I'm going to have to distract myself and put, a set time during my day, say 6 p.m. I'm going to dwell into this. I'm going to, my tendency to overthink, I can leave it until then. So setting a time frame and distracting ourselves for the time being, so we can focus on other things that are going on in our life and in our job. And the other thing that's more effective in the long run is disputation. So this is where you see the entire model in action, which is the D and E steps. Disputation is when, you have the you have to play like you were a lawyer, and this happened, this adverse situation, your belief is you're bad at your job. Okay, so how do I dispute this? You need to gather evidence. Can you gather evidence of all of the times you were actually good at your job? And can you actually gather evidence of all of the times you were or felt bad about your job? Can you put them together? Which ones outweigh the other, on a natural level and not on a perceived level? The other one is to consider alternatives. Is it actually that it was a bad report, or is it that maybe the client wasn't clear enough in what they expected? Because that can also be an alternative, and that has an implication on what we feel afterwards. Then the implications. So what do all of these make me feel as a result? And the last step, usefulness. Consider how useful to you these thoughts actually are. Like feeling that you're not good at your job as a result of a bad report. Is this something that serves you in the long term? And be truthful about that, because I know we have the tendency to say, oh yeah, it's going to ruin my career, but that's not something that's useful for us. And so if you do these steps, it should lead you to the very last stage, which is the energization. If you feel like these steps are complete and you feel a bit more in control, it's the aim of it, right? To feel like there's alternatives to it. If the client wasn't clear enough, for example, then we have a path to growth, because we can ask next time, okay, what do you actually expect me to do? We know from other evidence that we're good at our job so that we can deliver. And this leads you to be energized in the path to growth. So a negative experience can actually lead to a change, and a positive change. But one point that I want to make is that, we don't want to be positive at all costs. Now, this is, a path to growth that is different from toxic positivity, or like the lucky girl syndrome that was all the rage in, on TikTok last year. because we have to distinguish when to use optimism. We have to use it flexible and not blindly, because we cannot use this as an excuse to not take ownership for our mistakes, especially when we are the ones to actually make the mistake. So we're not aiming at silencing the bias in all instances, because as we've seen, it's got an adaptive function. We just want to be able to find ways to adapt to challenges and to silence it only when it's not useful for us. So you should apply learned optimism where you should not apply learned optimism when the cost of failure is high. So for example, when there's an illness involved, there's a death or so on as a result of neglecting threats. So if you're on the street and like you just don't care about the negative outcomes that might come across because like you have this sketchy feeling, but you tend to ignore it, maybe not. Like in some cases, negativity is fine. Negativity protects us. So I'm not here advocating for silencing it altogether, just when you recognize that it's damaging for yourself. And the last thing I'm going to leave you on is that, the way you explain what happens to you and talk about it shapes the way that you're going to experience those events and those challenges, and also the way that you're going to respond to them. So at the end of the day, your life is your story, and the most important listener of your story is yourself. So make sure that whenever you narrate it to yourself, you tell a good one. And that was it. These are my contacts if you want to talk through it, if you have any questions, and also if you want to have a look at any of my other work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I think when it comes to negativity bias and stuff like that, and the types of feedback that you talk about, I think implementing them can also make your company more inclusive, because I remember seeing one of your slides there about, people panicking when they don't have any information about, what a meeting's going to be about and stuff. And I know me as a neurodivergent person, that if I don't have enough context, it just sends me into blind panic. And that's quite common. So I think, by following the steps that you've got, it can help all around.
Yeah.
So I can see as well that we've got quite a lot of questions, so I can get started and read them to you. First up, we've got a question from Jordan, which says, would you say negativity bias can be passed down from your family?
I wouldn't say a genetic level. I mean, to be honest, I haven't looked at evidence that suggests that, and that's probably a good line of research. I would say there is a dimension where it's like what you learn as part of the system you're inserted in. As in, like if your family tendencies are to catastrophize everything that happens to you, then you might pick up on that, based on your experience. But yeah, that's more what I see. Like it's, more of a learned pattern in that sense, rather than genetically passed down. But that's really interesting because that's something I might look at.
Yeah, like from my experience, I know that I've looked into it from a cultural perspective, and studies do show that, for example, if you are in a negative, well, I don't like calling them a negative culture, but Jordan, I guess you are Slavic from your name. I'm from the Czech Republic. And I know that, for example, Slavic culture, we do tend to focus on the negative, and we are quite, negative people compared to certain different countries. And I know if you take a look at the works of, Vygotsky and stuff like that, who talk about how your behavior is passed down as part of the culture that you grow up in, so it's not, as you said, it's not biologically passed down, but the culture that you grow up in is definitely going to impact how well you deal with negativity and stuff.
Yeah.
So we've got another question. When you say negative bias doesn't affect older generations, is that because they feel less peer pressure?
So I wouldn't say it doesn't affect older generation. That was an hypothesis I came with based on the fact that the pattern of activation is less pronounced than younger population. So I still feel like it's something that affects older generations, but something that we could speculate on is the fact that they might have seen so many, so many challenging situations, because the more you go on with age, it's no more about just work maybe, or about the teenage boyfriend leaving us, like it's actual family stuff that might go wrong. It's actual hurdles that are harder to go through. So they might just have experienced more stuff that, how do you say, kind of takes away from the minor hurdles. So again, I don't think that it's something that as we age becomes really lower in terms of systematic pattern, but it might be something that we get more attuned to. So we display it for just maybe bigger thing. But again, like that's non-exclusive. That it's another line of research that has to be expanded, because it depends greatly on the experiences that we live and the environment that we're in.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Next question. For two-way feedback, sometimes constructive feedback from employee to management is perceived negatively. Do you have any suggestions based on your research on how to avoid negativity bias?
So that's on them really. As in, I think, I understand the challenge, because I think culturally, it's something really new to allow employees to give a two-way feedback. So people are not used to it. And sometimes they feel like it's a necessary step just to have those like high scores on the employee survey. I think, to be honest, like, when it's so, in order for it not to be perceived negatively, I feel like, reframing the language can be, a good way to sort of avoid how they perceive the feedback. But it cannot come only from you. It also needs to be sort of worked on the other level, on the other like receptive side. So if you were, I don't know what an example could be, but say that, you're not really, you don't really find the value of a meeting that you have weekly and that spans for an hour talking about nothing. Maybe instead of saying, look, I don't really see the value of it, because that the person is going to take it badly, you might be like, what if we use this time to maybe bring up new ideas? Or what if we use this time to do a brown bag lunch, sort of a learning opportunity? So focus on the solution, try not to expose the problem, but to like proactively go on with solutions, because it might be better for the way it's received. But again, like, it shouldn't be just an effort that we do on our side. It's a bilateral effort that needs to be taken, like being able to take on feedback.
Oh, that's such a tough one, because when you were talking about that, I just started thinking back to organizations that I've worked at before, and some of them were very good at taking feedback. Some, because of the company culture, it was just like, no, you do not give feedback to your senior people, and that can be quite tough. But it's definitely a them problem rather than a you problem. And there's so many different factors, like mindset and everything, as to why these people do not want to take feedback. So yeah, definitely agree with you on
It
trying.
also it also affects the way that that as an organization you can grow, because if you're just fixed on the mindset and on your only like tunnel vision, then when something else that changes the direction comes along, you don't have any ways to see any other avenues. I've encountered, not personally, but I've encountered people that have told me, like, the vision of my company is this, but the landscape's changing, and I cannot make them understand that, it's not only their vision, it's also like what comes from the customers, right? Sometimes it's not only listening to your employees. If we look at the marketing perspective, it's listening to what comes from the bottom, from the users. What are they actually telling you? Is it these, product really helpful? Do they need it like faster? Do they need it in another color? So yeah, it's actually dangerous for an organization not to be able to take on feedback.
Oh, that's so true. I'm actually in the middle of writing an article about organizations having growth and fixed mindsets, because you don't often think of an organization being able to have these mindsets, but they do. And this is exactly the sort of thing that goes into it. I think you could even do like a webinar on that by itself, even. And yeah, I think that's it. I think we've just got really nice comments saying that love that you included quotes from people in the industry. So yeah, I think that went down really well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really happy I was able to talk through it because it's something I'm really passionate about. And I think something that, especially if you don't have opportunities to be exposed to this, you might feel a bit lonely in the way that you're like, oh, I'm always so negative about things. And some people, when you talk about it, they might be, yeah, but there's people dying from this and this and this. And that's valid. But we need to acknowledge our feelings too. And we need to find ways to actually constructively address them.
Definitely. I think one life-changing thing that I heard or that I read when I started doing my psychology degree was that sometimes being too optimistic is actually a problem because we're always like, oh my gosh, you're so optimistic. I would love to be like that and be like less negative. And you often don't realize that sometimes having a bit of negativity is actually a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's adaptive. It's just like finding the balance when it's not being adaptive.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us. I think that went so well and was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, if anybody would like to connect with Giulia, you have her details from the last slide. And thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.